to the Snakeherder Podcast.
Hello, welcome to the first ever Snakeherder Podcast. My name is Matthew Nauman and I'm your host. I suppose the first thing for me to do is to kind of explain what this whole podcast is all about. This is a new thing I've decided to start doing. What I'm basically looking to do is to just discuss herpetoculture, snake keeping, and other reptiles and amphibians as well, but I'm going to be focused mostly on keeping snakes because that's what I know best. That's what I've been doing for as long as I've been interested in herps. I do some field herping as well, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that. I also know some really great people in the hobby industry, whatever you want to call it, who I will probably be having in here for interviews. I got some people who have some really interesting insights to share with everybody. But I guess first and foremost, why I'm doing this, bottom line, I like to talk shop. It's going to be fun for me to sit around and talk about snakes. Sometimes it's going to be pretty one-sided with me just sitting here talking, and other times, hopefully, I'll have someone to have a little back and forth with, keep it a little more entertaining for you guys. It's an attempt to be helpful, answer questions, share some tips. I'd love to hear from people with criticisms, questions, comments, encouragement, whatever you have for me. Send me an email at snakeherder@gmail.com. That's probably going to be the easiest way to get a hold of me. I'm kind of also, I've had a hard time finding any other podcast covering this topic. There's other stuff out there. The one I really enjoy is Green Tree Python Keeper Radio. That's a really, really good podcast. And I kind of wanted to discuss the snakes that I keep. I do keep green tree pythons. I don't have any currently, but I have kept many of them in the past. It's a species I really enjoy, and we will talk about them at some point here. There's going to be probably a lot of ball python talk here. Everything from, I have a whole list of topics I plan on covering in the future. Everything from where the market is, things about breeding, and I'd love to talk about equipment, cages, racks, things like that. Doing things yourself, what you can do, what you shouldn't do, all opinion stuff just out front here. I'm never somebody who's going to tell you that what you're doing, if it's working, is wrong. I just don't believe in doing that. So I try to be positive. I try to, accept the fact that I do not have all the answers, and I don't do everything the best way, I'm sure. I do things that have worked for me in the past, and I'm going to share a lot of that with you, what has worked for me in the past. And as I continue working with animals, I'll be sharing, any of my successes and any of my failures with you also. So, complete transparency here. So I have, and if you guys have topics you'd like to hear covered, again, email me, snakeherder@gmail.com. That would be great to start getting some input from other people. But I guess first and foremost, what this episode is going to be about is basically I'm going to explain the whole story of why I've become Snakeherder Constrictors, who I am, how I grew up, and why I'm interested in snakes and reptiles in general, how I got where I am, basically. So maybe in the future you'll have a little better idea of who you're listening to, and it puts things in perspective, because I'm going to have a different viewpoint than somebody who's brand new to the hobby. I'm going to have a different viewpoint than the people who've been in it for 30 years. I've been involved in it for a very long time, and we'll get into all that. But I think I have come from a kind of common place that a lot of other people are coming from in this hobby. I've been doing it for quite a while. I've had some successes. I've toyed with the idea of it being a business, but I've kept it, a hobby for many reasons, and that'll all come up here. So the bottom line is today is going to be an introduction. I'm going to give you the Snakeherder story. Before we get into that, really quick, I just want to thank my first sponsor, Reptile Rapture in Monona, Wisconsin. They're a fantastic group of people. It's so hard to find a reptile dedicated and focused pet store. Everything from supplies to animals, they breed there. It's a reptile pet store done the right way, and they're really great people there. Richard Allen and Cheryl Allen. Everybody who works out there is just great. You can't go wrong. Get great advice, great animals, great, everything is just, I can't say enough about them. I've been a customer since they started and a friend of theirs for many years. So big thank you to Reptile Rapture for being involved, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more about them, and you will probably be hearing from them at some point during one of these shows as well. So anyway, I guess best thing to do is to get started with the Snakeherder story now. So I was raised in Madison, Wisconsin. It's south central Wisconsin, and in an area was a neighborhood full of houses, but we were very close to a piece of woods that was part of the Cherokee Marsh natural area. So we spent a lot of time playing around in the woods. We used to call the area the Frog Pond because you could go down there in the little creek area that you could always find leopard frogs and wood frogs and green frogs and occasionally some garter snakes, quite a few of those really, decay snakes, red belly snakes, and once in a while there was the holy grail was to find a fox snake, because I remember being a little kid, like single digits still, and just being fascinated by them. They looked like little pythons to me. Back when I was a kid, I was born in 1977, so when I was a kid, your information came from encyclopedias and anything you could find in your school library. There was not a lot of information for you. Everything you found was a picture of a snake that was either labeled boa, python, or anaconda, and very, very little, I didn't know the difference between any of them other than just what their patterns looked like, and what we called a python looked like, a berm or possibly a rock python, and so, I had very little information. Anytime I saw a picture or one in a book, something on a nature show, I was just infatuated with them. I thought they were the coolest animals. Anytime I was at the zoo, if there was a reptile house at a zoo, I had to be there. That was my favorite part of it. And, anything I kept was something like a garter snake that was in a 5-gallon bucket in the garage for a couple of days, and then we let it go. And, so that was kind of the extent of my keeping as a kid. I always liked the idea of someday being that guy with a pet python or something, but, I never took it real seriously. Wasn't a common thing back in, when I was a kid in the 80s. Fast forward to high school, and I had a friend, a girl named Shannon, who had a pet boa constrictor she got from the Humane Society named Hercules. And I just remember going over to her house and being just, that's all I wanted to do was ask her, oh, can we take Hercules out? That was like just the coolest thing to me, was she actually had a pet boa constrictor. So I used to handle that whenever she would let me, and just thought it was the coolest thing. And I started deciding, I started talking to my parents about actually getting a snake. I had a job and everything, and they kind of begrudgingly started to agree to the idea. So I started reading books about different species, and there was one pet store called Aquarius Pets that sold snakes, and I went there, and they had some berms and boas and stuff, and they were pretty expensive, and I knew I didn't want anything that big, even though I liked the idea. And I ended up deciding on a California King, and they had some really cool Cali Kings there, and I put some money down on one and bought all the stuff and brought it home to set it up, the aquarium and heat pad and all that stuff. And when I had enough money then to come pick up the snake a few days later, I got there and they had a new shipment of baby ball pythons in, and there's probably 6 to 8 baby ball pythons all cohabitated in this big tank, crawling with mites, probably freshly imported from Africa, and I was just enamored with them. They had a book about them, so I bought the book, and I changed my deposit over to the ball python, went home and read everything I could about it, came back in a couple of days and bought the ball python. I kept that snake for several years, right up until a couple of years out of high school, when first time I moved in with somebody else, and that wasn't going to fly. I had that one, and I had at that point acquired a boa constrictor as well, which was the first boad to ever bite me. Totally my own fault. Wasn't any big deal. Just reached in too fast and got bit, and it was pretty much the first time I'd been bit by a snake. Just a little anecdote. Really didn't amount to anything. And actually I acquired that boa constrictor in a trade. I had worked at a pet store, and I had access to ordering the price list, and I had ordered a Borneo python that I'm sure was imported. It was scarred up, crawling with mites, like everything was back then. And I kept it for a while, and it was so mean I ended up trading it to a different pet store for a boa. It was a really cool marbled Borneo that I'd kill to have back today, but it would have been a problem. And back then, I was very new to all this, didn't have much experience, so I ended up keeping a boa and a ball python in the mid-90s, and in the late 90s I had to part with them as I got older and moved out and started doing things like that. So anyway, I had this ball python for a while. I really enjoyed it, just a normal. And when I moved in I ended up getting married pretty young, and always wanted to have a ball python again, and it wasn't going to happen. I ended up getting divorced, and part of my whole divorce, when I moved out on my own, I decided that was part of my life I wanted back, and I wasn't going to compromise it again. So I got my first ball python again, and started enjoying that. I had a ball python, and actually I picked up a Kenyan sand boa also. And so those were my two little roommates at my first apartment after my divorce, and so I was really enjoying just having a couple of normals around. Well, then I was kind of late on the internet bandwagon. I just never spent acres of time on there like some of my friends did. As I got a little bit older and I started spending more time poking around on the internet, I discovered a few websites. Like I started reading Ralph Davis and Garrick DeMeyer's sites of Royal Constrictor Designs and Ralph Davis Reptiles. And I started watching YouTube videos about snakes, and I discovered what was happening with the morphs and what blew up the ball python market. And it was a really kind of it wasn't new at that point. I mean, we're talking, mid 2000s, like 2002 to 2005 kind of time frame. Things were really expensive still. Pastels were several $100s. Albinos were a couple of thousand. Caramel albino, I remember the first reptile expo I went to, I saw one for $4,000. Things like piebalds were really pretty much, cost prohibitive at that point in the game. And I started studying them, though, and reading about the genetics behind it. And I remembered all of it from high school, the Punnett squares and the simple recessive and dominant and codominant genes. All that just made sense to me right off the bat. And I started kicking around the idea of if I was going to get another snake, I'd like to get something that was a morph, preferably a dominant or codominant, so that I could reproduce it maybe. Just thought it would be interesting. All these things I was reading in books and seeing online looked like a cool thing to do to me. Money wasn't a real big deal about it, other than the fact that I was going to have to spend some money to do this, so I was hoping I would make some of it back. So eventually I end up moving in with who is now my wife, and she was totally cool with the snakes I already had, but wasn't real crazy about the idea of getting a whole bunch of them. And I kind of sold her on the idea by allowing us to get a second dog in exchange for me getting another snake that I could breed to the one I had. And that kind of snowballed quickly into me getting, well, if I'm going to have a couple, I may as well get a rack so I can split them up. And then it was a matter of, let's see, I started adding pretty quickly at that point. Somewhere around 2007, I ended up starting my relationship speaking with Garrick DeMeyer, who I consider a friend now. And I went up to I ended up on the phone with him ordering some snakes and picking them up at an expo. I got my first pair of albino hets and a pair of piebald hets and a male pastel that was possible het ghost, and that was over $1,000 for that group of snakes back then, for totally normals that were hets. It was a kind of big deal to me to spend that much on 5 snakes. I had no idea that I would necessarily be successful at it or anything. And started raising them up and adding things here and there. I ended up getting a spider. Big investment for me was a pair of Mojaves. That was $1,000 for that pair of snakes alone over time. Things have changed quite a bit since then, and that's a topic for a later date. But it was a cool thing for me, though, to have this collection that was kind of rare in my neighborhood at that time. I'd go to the pet store and buy big bags of frozen feeders, and people would ask me, and I'd tell them what I had, and it was very impressive to have 7 or 8 ball pythons that were all morphs and hets for things. So I thought it was a pretty cool thing at that point. And I was pretty hooked. I was raising things up. I had a few snakes that were getting close to breeding size, and I hadn't done anything yet. And I think that was starting to probably make my wife nervous. If she hasn't admitted it, I would assume it, because I was spending more and more and more, and I wasn't producing anything. I didn't have anything. And people are always asking me, oh, where are these baby snakes? And I was like, I wasn't there yet. So, I ended up going up to Garrick's place in Wausau and seeing his facility, which really just, fueled the fire more so. I ended up picking up an axanthic and an albino, and started pairing up some snakes at this point. And I was getting tail locks, but I only had 2 that were breeding size. I had a normal, and I was putting a spider in with her, and they were breeding. Everything seemed to be going right, but I had my pair of het pieds were ready to breed. This was like the fall of 2009, and no activity at all. The male seemed scared of her. He would stay as far away from her as possible. So last ditch attempt, I ended up putting in that pastel possible het ghost male, and I thought I was seeing an ovulation, and at the time my snake room was like the coldest room in our house. Not by design, just by circumstance. And, I was expecting those eggs 30 days, 40 days after ovulation, or after that last shed. And I pretty much wrote it off because it had just kind of come and gone. And suddenly, I believe it was May 10th of 2010. It was after a Mastodon concert. Me and my wife came home, and I just decided to peek in on my snakes, and the normal female was sitting on 5 eggs. They looked pretty dry. I almost wondered if I missed them. I didn't remember if I had looked like the day before. But I had my incubator all set up and ready to go. It was like 2 in the morning after a concert, and I had to work the next day, and I was just happy as could be setting up these eggs. About a week later, I believe, the het pied female laid a clutch of eggs as well. Both of them laid 5 eggs. So my first year, 2010, I got 2 clutches, 5 eggs apiece. So that was kind of cool. We had just moved into our own, we just bought a house and moved into it, and I had my snake room, and first clutches were hitting the cage floor, and so I kind of felt like I'd finally done something right. So anyway, that first year I got the first clutch. I had 3 spiders and 2 normals. That was a really cool thing for me to get visibles on my first clutch ever. And then the other one, I had 2 pastels and 3 normals. A lot of the normals and one of the pastels had some really good het pied markers, so I ended up keeping one of the pastel females. She was actually one that I ended up raising up to adulthood and getting my first clutch of eggs from her, and actually producing a pied from her from a possible het pied pastel female. I never hit the pastel pied, but there's still time to do things like that. Anyway, I guess I'll backtrack just a little bit here. Shortly before we moved to our new house, and when I got those first 2 clutches, ironically too, when I did all the math, that female normal that laid her eggs, she had to have been post-ovulation at the time that we moved. So it's kind of cool to think, I didn't even realize when we moved that she was gravid. So I'm really glad that clutch worked out the way it did, and that it didn't have any complications or any problems. But before we moved, I decided that the sand boas were taking up room, that that I could have more ball pythons, and I ended up, just by coincidence, I'm driving down the road and I see a pickup truck in front of me with a sticker in the back that says Reptile Rapture with a web address, reptilerapture.net. Still the same web address, so I highly encourage you to check them out. But anyway, I saw that and remembered it and went home and sent an email and just said, hey, what are you all about? And went to the website and looked, and he was breeding and selling reptiles on a much different scale than he is now. And fairly sparse website, but either way, I ended up telling him, I have a couple of sand boas I'm thinking about passing on to somebody else if you're interested. And he said, absolutely. Turns out he lived just a couple of miles away from me, came over, bought these sand boas from me, and that was the beginning of a very long what's now friendship and business relationship. A lot of animals have changed hands between the two of us. So anyway, that's kind of how I got into knowing the guys from Reptile Rapture, and that's before the store ever existed. So anyway, so I was having a little bit of success with my ball pythons. That first year was just 2 clutches. The next year I had a few. For several years there, I was producing clutches of ball pythons every year. I was never producing large numbers. I was getting some cool variety though, and one of the problems I had was I am the worst guy in the world when it comes to holdbacks. Now, most people have the problem of keeping everything and not selling enough. I have the opposite problem. I always tell myself if I produced it once, I can produce it again. So over the years, instead of keeping my best stuff and making my breeding projects better and better, I had a tendency to sell everything right off the bat. And I was doing repeat pairings and just changing up which ones were with which over the years. So that certainly had an impact on my ability to, make any really usable money or any, huge recovery of what I'd been spending, but I was enjoying it, and that was the most important thing. And I was selling everything I was hatching was selling, and I was recovering a lot of the money I was, spending, but not really profiting and not expanding my business beyond anything, just what I would buy and add to the collection. All my best stuff I would hatch would get sold. My first pieds, my first caramels, bumblebees, super Mojaves, anything cool that I produced was out the door as fast as it hatched and was established. So that was one of the things that it was. You'll find when I have a discussion about the ball python market eventually that I'll be discussing some of the pitfalls and some of the things that I did wrong with regards to making money on it. Not necessarily anything I did wrong with regards to enjoying myself and enjoying the hobby. So we'll get into that later. So anyway, at this point I was kind of, enjoying what I'm doing, and I started my website, Snakeherder.com. It still exists, although it is in bad need of an update. I haven't really changed much on there for quite a while. Most of what's on there is about sand boas. At one time or another, I had a really cool website up and running, and I keep changing it to reflect changes in what I've done in the hobby, and right now it's kind of in limbo. So I also started a YouTube channel. That Snakeherder Videos is my channel name, and that's something I'm really proud of. I've produced over 100 videos just between things on my phone and a small handheld camera, and I've got over 1,000 subscribers and over 100,000 views. I know in the grand scheme of things, there's people who get that every video and every couple of weeks, but to me, just the idea that 1,000 different people were interested in what I was up to and had watched me talk about snakes 100,000 times was very encouraging, and it made me feel good about myself, and it's been mostly positive. So that's still up there if you want to get a look at me talking about some of my snakes. I also did the Facebook thing just because you kind of have to now. I didn't want to because I didn't want to have to put things in more than one place, but it's it's a resource that you can't ignore if you're going to be doing this. So I continue to have a Facebook page for Snakeherder Constrictors. I started keeping green tree pythons as well. That's something that I really would like to get back into. I don't currently have any. I had some really great animals from Rico Walder for a while. I had several Beox from Richard over the years. I've had some Manokwari that were, some really cool animals that from different places that I would like to end up doing a couple of shows dedicated to green tree pythons for sure. I still know the guy who owns my animals from Rico, and we'll certainly be talking to him at some point or another, and he's hopefully going to be breeding those really soon. I also expanded for a while. I kept tinkering with some other species. I kept some blood pythons, short-tail pythons, Borneo pythons. I really enjoy those, but they realistically do get larger than I care to keep. They need bigger caging and more space, and I've always had a tendency, I don't handle them enough to keep them from being just unpredictable. I've never had one that's real bitey, but they're just they'd be real twitchy, and I just never fully trusted them. and that just takes kind of some of the fun out of it for me. I'm not keeping reptiles for the thrill of dodging teeth. I'm doing it because I enjoy the animals. I discussed the fact that they take up more space, and realistically, if anyone has the space for them, I shouldn't say anyone, but as far as a hobbyist goes, I have a pretty good amount of space. I was lucky in that when my wife and I found out we were expecting our first child, we decided we wanted to move the collection out of the house. The house we were living in has no garage, or had no garage, so we had one built. My brother John, who's a fantastic carpenter, pretty much did the entire thing. We had a guy do concrete. I have a great insulated slab. The concrete stays like in the upper 60s when it's below zero outside. This place is just bulletproof. It's 14 by 24, heated, power about every 6 feet on the wall. And for a while it was packed full of racks, full of ball pythons, green tree pythons, short-tailed pythons, bloods, sand boas. And eventually I found myself kind of over my head. I had more stuff going on, and things that were, in development weren't ready to breed yet. The money coming back in was coming in slower than going back out, and I had to start picking and choosing what I was going to keep, and I made some decisions with regards to what I was going to keep and sell that, I did what I had to do, but I probably could have done it in a different way and maybe would have been able to keep more of my animals. But I ended up selling virtually everything. For a while I decided it was going to be nothing but green tree pythons, so I saved those guys to the end. Eventually I found I had to sell those too. They went out the door to take care of some financial hardships, and then I decided at that point, when I was starting over more or less, to do something with less money involved in it. So I bought a couple of Kenyan sand boas. I had some really great ones for a while, and in what year would that have been? 2016, I produced my first litter of Kenyan sand boas. They were nuclears. There were some really beautiful animals in that litter. It was my first and only foray into working with live bears as far as breeding goes. And to be perfectly honest with you, I thought it was cool, but I didn't enjoy it as much as working with pythons. I missed that whole process of producing eggs and the incubation and seeing them come out that way. It was cool to just open the cage and have a bunch of new snakes, but it was really cool that I was able to share it with my son, that we were able to go pick through the sand and find all the babies, and that was all exciting, but I missed working with pythons, and so I started, and I really missed the fact that, my son was getting to the age, now he's 5, and I decided I was going to let him start handling some animals, and the sand boas I had were all just so twitchy. Some of them had a propensity to bite. They weren't enjoyable to handle, and I wasn't ready to put one in his hands because they were likely to squirm away and hit the floor, and problems would ensue, and so we decided not to go that route. We still have one that's his first pet snake. It lives in an aquarium, and I take care of it, and it's basically for observing, and we don't get to see it a whole lot because it spends a lot of time under the substrate. It's still a cool little snake. It's his pet named Blaze, and started thinking again about, I decided to evaluate what I really enjoyed the most in snakes, and it's always been ball pythons. As far as they're so handleable, the variety of, the appearances, they're just kind of the perfect captives as far as pet snakes go. They don't get too big. They're easy to handle. And I thought that it would be really cool for him to grow up seeing some more ball pythons. He hadn't seen them since he was little, other than when we go visit, see them other places like Reptile Rapture. We go, every couple of weeks just to look. And so I started kicking around the idea of getting another ball python. And, of course, I just can't do that without having a project of some kind going on. So I'm starting to slowly build up a small collection again. And I'm kind of keeping the Snakeherder thing going, and without having so much on the line, without having so much money in it. And again, I think the topic for the next episode is going to be the ball python market, and I'm going to kind of be able to explain my stance and where I'm at and why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it in that episode a little better, I think, because it's now you don't have to invest the huge amounts of money to try to reproduce a single gene. You can invest smaller amounts of money and get more genes involved and just get a real grab bag of appearances. And it's not always about trying to get just that one that has every single gene on it. It's just about, I'm trying to produce some clutches that are going to be interesting and varied. So one of the first animals I ended up picking up here, I got a cinnamon enchi, which I think is just a great subtle combination. To the untrained eye, it could almost pass for normal. I bought it from Richard at Reptile Rapture, and it's very handleable. My son is now confident holding on to it. It's been great to see him finally starting to actually have the snakes in his hands instead of just looking at them from afar. So it's really kind of changed, it really expanded his interest, to say the very least. We also have a male then on the way as soon as it's established, from another friend of mine, Paul Zulke at Key Reptiles, and he produced a banana enchi that we believe is also a yellow belly. That those are going to make some amazing animals, and if we hit on everything, we're talking about banana, super enchi, cinnamon, yellow bellies, something like that is going to just look amazing. And any other combination of those genes is going to look great. It's going to be a cool clutch. And we're going to start picking and choosing and getting some small projects put together here again. You guys will be hearing all about them as they develop. You guys will be hearing about, eggs and babies when they're happening. And we're going to be talking to some other people as well that have more going on than me, I would assume. But the other thing that we're going to get into from time to time is field herping. That's something I really enjoy. I don't consider myself very good at it, but I'm lucky to live in an area that's real close to some woods, and we regularly find, different herps. I've got some really cool turtles that we find a lot of. Frogs and toads are obviously pretty common. I finally found my first salamander this year, which was a big deal. There are hognose and fox snakes around here, which are both favorites of mine. I'll have some stories to tell about that stuff. My son and I found a fantastic looking hognose snake this year. So that's realistically the story of where I come from as far as herpetoculture goes. As far as my personal life goes, I'll share a few things just so you have an idea of but this stuff will all kind of trickle out over the course of the podcast. But I'm married to a beautiful, awesome woman named Autumn, and we have a smart, funny, awesome little boy named Blake, and a dog named Maggie, and we live a little ways north of Madison, and we enjoy fishing and camping. I love to hunt, but I haven't really done much of that since my son's been born. We do a lot of field herping, hiking, like to do outdoor stuff. That's kind of the theme for us in general. Lucky to do a lot of fishing. I live close to a trout stream. My son is an avid trout fisherman with me, and he's my field herping buddy, and anything I find is always that much better when he's with me. You'll be hearing a lot about him over time, just like when you heard him at the beginning of the show. I hope to have him to introduce us for every episode. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to one guy ramble about his personal story and where he comes from. But the bottom line is we're going to talk snakes here more than anything. And we're also going to talk just other herp-related topics. And I think next episode, I'm going to try to do at least one a month. Maybe I'll try to get a couple out a month. The next episode, though, should be, a little less one-sided. I mean, it's still going to be me talking probably, but ball pipe. We're either going to get into the Python market, some talk about field herping, or else possibly I'm kind of thinking because of the time of the year that this would be a perfect time for me to discuss breeding temperatures and conditioning ball pythons for breeding, and because this is the time of year that's really critical, and we'll also discuss the fact that a lot of people believe that it's a complete waste of time and that there's no need to do it. But and I know plenty of people have had success doing things differently than me. But I'm going to tell you how I've always gone about doing it. I've always had a pretty successful system as far as all my clutches tend to hit the cage floor real close together. I mean, I would have a half a dozen or so females, and all my breeding, and almost all of them would lay their eggs within a month of each other. So to me, that means obviously the manipulations I'm doing and the fact that I was expecting the eggs when they were happening meant that what I was doing was having an impact. Whether or not it was necessary, that's anybody's guess. But I'd like to explain the way I do things, and feel free to email me and tell me, yeah, I don't like the way you do it, or ask me questions about how I do it, or tell me what you do differently, what we do the same. There's, a lot of ways to skin that cat. So hopefully you guys will tune in again. Hopefully I didn't bore you by just talking about myself for half an hour here, but I thought it's important that you guys would know something about me and why I do what I do, and what kind of snakes I like and what I work with, and what we're going to do here in the future. So once again, I'd like to thank Reptile Rapture for their involvement in this project. A bunch of great people, and I can't recommend them enough. And I hope you guys join me next time for another Snakeherder podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and take care.